between 2021 and 2024. In 13 out of 16 presidential elections, new party won. As I told recently, new party, I'm talking about of this organization with has more or less 10 years of existence. Were there any exceptions? Yeah, there were at least 3 exceptions. Brazil in 2024, Venezuela and Ecuador, freedom advances, La Libertad Avanza in Argentina. Libertad Avanza in Argentina was created in 2021. And others, new ideas in El Salvador, realizando metas in Panama, Revolucionario Moderno Party in Dominican Republic, and Morena in Mexico. Well, you may see the exceptions. In Brazil, the Workers' Party, el Partido de los Trabajadores. In Paraguay, the Colorado Party, the Red Party. You can see this data that will call your attention. The Colorado Party was created in 1887. We are talking about the party of the 19th cycle. And in Uruguay, you have the Frente Amplio, Broad Front, which was created in 1971. Well, another fact to highlight, as I said in my presentation, was the existence of, let's say, 2 conflicting and convergent trends. On one side, ideological fragmentation, but on the other side, polarization. Well, you see some data. 3 out of 17 cases may be located in the, let's say, the far left. The cases of Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela. Another 5 out of 17 may be located in the left, Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Honduras, and Mexico. Another 2 of these 17 may be located in the center left, Chile, Uruguay. 3 out of 17 countries may be located in the right, Costa Rica, Panama, and Peru. Paraguay is the only one which may be located in the center right. And finally, you've got 3 out of 17 countries that may be located in the far right, Argentina, Ecuador, El Salvador, as examples. Argentina with Javier Milei, whom I'll talk in the next panel. In this table, you may see all the data that I have presented. In far left, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela. And seeing this table, you may see the presence or the existence of 2 conflicting trends. On one side, you've got the landscape of political or ideological fragmentation. On the other side, you've got the landscape of ideological polarization, ideological and electoral polarization. And I'm going to let's say my conceptual talk, which is the bad loser syndrome. But before conceptualizing the bad loser syndrome, let me remember the political scientist Adam Przeworski. Professor Przeworski reminds us that a fundamental component of democracy is given by the epic of the losers. This implies acceptance for normative or strategic reasons of unfavorable election outcomes. However, in recent years, there has been an increasing level of ignorance of election results that have led to the erosion of this fundamental democratic agreement. We will define this sort of political behavior as the bad loser syndrome. So how could we characterize this syndrome? First, the person versus the incumbent or not the incumbent who is suffering this syndrome don't accept the election result. In the second place, the incumbent or not the incumbent tends to manipulate the institutions as an expression of ignorance of the unfavorable electoral results. And third, the bad losers fail to comply with the resulting rights and protocols. Well, I show you all the different examples. Andrés López Obrador in Mexico, Hugo Chávez Frías, Enrique Capriles Radonsky, and Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner in Argentina, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Donald Trump in the United States. Well, I added the case of Donald Trump in this research. Keiko Fujimori in Peru and Jair Bolsonaro, as you know, in Brazil, have incurred during the last year in all or at least some of this practice described. In the next slide, let me show you some data, some results. I like to say that all this data takes part of a broader explanation, a broader research we have published the last year. But let me show you some results. Well, if you can see on the horizontal level, you have all the cases, AMLO, Hugo Chavez, and so on. And in the horizontal dimension, all the variables, dependent and independent variables, no? Bad loser, bad good loser, adjust not adjust result, election result, ideological or not ideological polarization, and the official opposing leadership role. That is incumbent, non-incumbent. In this table, I added two additional criteria: the type of election, maybe executive recall, legislative referendum, whatever, and the ideology of the political leaders, of the bad losers. Well, which are the principal results, or which are the main results? Well, first of all, the relation between a narrow margin results and the bad loser electoral behavior is strong. If election is defined with a narrow margin, the loser will adopt bad loser political behavior. Even stronger is the relationship between an atmosphere of ideological polarization and the political behavior of the bad loser. If there is a climate of ideological and electoral polarization, the loser will adopt bad loser political behavior. Regarding as these additional criteria, the position of leader in charge of the executive or opposition, that is the role of incumbent or non-incumbent, seems to be irrelevant to explain the political behavior of the bad loser. And finally, another fact to highlight is that neither ideological orientation nor the type of electoral competition don't seem to be relevant factors to explain the bad losers' political behavior. Well, in conclusion, this combination, the mix of incumbents defeat, emergence of new parties, electoral and ideological polarization, and bad loser political behavior, may us conclude that elections don't seem to be already the only game in town. Well, from my part, that's all. Thank you very much, and I will be delighted to hear the presentations of my colleague Eduardo and Silvia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Santiago. Thank you very much. It was, I think, a very complete presentation, and it shows very well the overview of the elections in Latin America and the situation we are facing with the bad losers, which is not just in the region of Latin America. So I'm not going to extend myself. I'm very punctually. We are going to pass the word to Professor Eduardo Gamarra. Professor Eduardo, the floor is yours. Please, if you want to share your presentation, you can do it. If you want me to do it, I can do it also.
I think I have it here. So let me see if I can share it. Just 1 second, please. Is it sharing?
Not yet. You can try again, please.
Are we sharing now? Hello? Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, Professor, we are just asking our IT department to make you host, co-host. In fact, you are a co-host. You should be able to share your screen.
Yeah, it should have it on there now.
Yeah, yeah. Let me try to do it. I have your presentation here.
Okay, something is happening here, so. I think you can see me now, right?
Yes, perfectly. We can see
Okay,
it.
great. All
Go
right.
ahead.
Well, I too want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this very interesting forum, and I'm delighted to be able to share the stage with Santiago Leira, whose works I'm familiar with and enjoyed very much the presentation because he gives us a lot of food for thought. And I want to obviously also look forward to Silvia Colombo's comments. So I want to do something a little perhaps more challenging and controversial than I should. But given the fact that we are in a moment of I don't know what to call it, whether it's transition, whether it's revolutionary, or what have you, I thought I would situate the conversation around elections, pragmatism, and geopolitics. And so to begin with, I guess what I'd like to sort of say is that uh, this year in particular, with elections in Honduras, elections on April 13th, the runoff in Ecuador, elections, of course, in Bolivia on August the 17th, elections in Honduras in late November, and elections in Chile. In addition to that, midterm elections in Argentina. 2025 could represent a serious critical juncture in terms of governance, right? And there are, of course, key tests that the region is facing. We're facing as a whole, how to deal with economic crisis, how to deal with the enormous challenges that organized crime is posing across the region, how to continue dealing with the problems of inequality, of course, and the return of poverty in countries that had once reached mid-level development stage, right? But above all, right, one of the things that we've all been looking at specifically in public opinion polls is the collapsing trust in democracy. And this isn't so much that people don't believe in democracy anymore, but that people do not basically trust that leaders can perform. And so, in some measure, it has to do with what Santiago was talking about, which is the problem of incumbencies, right? And the problem with incumbencies, in my view, is related to the problems of trust in democracy and trust in leadership. And above all, with this view that democracy is not performing. So we believe in democracy, but we just don't think that democracy is performing very well. And then, of course, the geopolitical shifts that we've been witnessing. And so my argument this afternoon is that this new reality demands pragmatism, both in terms of domestic governance and in terms of international relations. And largely in a context in which Washington, in particular, appears to be inspired by Morgenthal's realism, right? Those of you who've studied international relations, this idea that countries should not have friends, but countries have interests, right? And a Machiavellian kind of pragmatism, right? Whereby it's not, we should no longer be worried about the kinds of moral dimensions of foreign policy or even of domestic governance, but more by this kind of pragmatism that appears to be taking root all over the world. And so my question is, should Latin American leaders in 2025 prioritize national interests above ideology, above really everything else? And so let me spend just 2 seconds or so on this idea of Trump's transactional legacy, if you will, right? And we sort of saw this in his first period, right? But largely, I would say that in the 2 months he's been in office, he's already reshaped U.S.-Latin American relations with his transactional America First policy, right? Which is a very personalistic bilateral relationship focused on direct U.S. interests and largely around three things: immigration, tariffs, and narcotics. And it's an enormous shift away from what we had seen just a few months ago under Biden, multilateral frameworks, bilateral, et cetera, to now this, multilateral frameworks focusing on the OAS, focusing on the UN, focusing on, on kinds of collective responses. And now we're in this phase of very, very personal deals, right? And so in this sense, these new presidents that will be coming into office this year in the region will have to adjust to this pragmatism. And in some measure, they will have to adapt, as we have seen already in countries that have been visited, like Panama, like Honduras, like El Salvador, and the Dominican Republic, which are based on quid pro quo rather than on traditional alliances or even ideology. So the legacy effect as such is that the Latin American governments that'll emerge from these contexts, right, will in essence be forced to view inter-American relations in a much more transactional way, and they will at the same time be focused to look much more pragmatically at domestic issues as well. All right. So if we look at this, then going forward in my reasoning, right, voters across these countries are really demanding some tangible results on these four issues: economic stability, or growth, if you will, security against crime, reduced inequality, and of course, to a certain extent, strengthening democratic governance, or at least making incumbents stay in office a little bit longer, right? And so the expectations, I sort of summarize them with this idea in this context of low institutional trust, right? We've had enough talk, it's time to perform. Right. Now, having said that, then, what are those economic realities and the pragmatic adjustments that people seem to be facing? Right. Uh, you all are in the region, and in the case of Santiago, of course, he's living it, and so is Silvia. Right. Argentina's therapy under Milei, which of course is in some measure this pragmatic adjustment. Right. But in the case of Bolivia right now, we're also looking at a moment of urgent reforms, especially in terms of reducing subsidies, dealing with currency problems, and so on. And this belief that somehow, right, there needs to be this enormous pragmatism on the economic front. We're looking at similar trends in Ecuador and Honduras, this balancing fiscal discipline and growth. Although Ecuador might give a very interesting surprise if you look at the surveys and see how Luisa González is performing much better than the incumbent. So if Santiago is correct, that incumbency, that very short incumbency in Ecuador, may give way to this kind of memory, nostalgia for another era. And then in Chile, where you have again this market-driven optimism to a certain extent that's pushing toward the right, right? The polls tell us that the right will be back in office in later this year. Now, the problem, in my view, is that these Latin American leaders that are coming in are going to have to choose effective reforms over ideological comfort, so to speak. And the realist approach, right, to a certain extent, is this idea to engage the IMF, to engage investors, and to engage traditional economic partners in a rather pragmatic way. But the key test in all of these is how can you avoid social unrest while implementing unpopular but necessary reforms, right? I think you're seeing this very dramatically in Argentina, where President Milei, to a certain extent, has managed to keep his head above water. He's still at around that 50% mark, but it's increasingly difficult. And that's why that election in October is so key for Milei to continue with these pragmatic, for lack of a better term, adjustments. Now, the other issue, of course, is security and pragmatic realism. And this is really a problem, not so much perhaps in some countries as it is in others, but certainly in countries like Ecuador with the huge issues of security that it has and the trend towards mano dura, right? Honduras on the left following El Salvador's hardline methods, right? The popularity of Bukele across the board, even in places like Argentina. And the Chilean case, responding pragmatically to what they consider to be immigration-linked crime. The problem, of course, as all of you know in this context, is that leaders have to balance pragmatically these short-term security gains with long-term democratic stability. And here is a real problem that we have found in survey after survey, that people are willing, in the context of insecurity, are willing to surrender basic civil rights in exchange for security. Perhaps the most extreme case is El Salvador, but we're now even seeing it in the United States, right? Where people are essentially witnessing the erosion of civil rights with the promise of some kind of pragmatism. In my view, the real risk, of course, is that this leads to democratic erosion, and pragmatism of this sort inevitably tilts toward authoritarianism. Inequality, I'll rush through this very quickly because we know that in a usual context, we often talk about governments on the left favoring redistribution and social spending, and centrist governments emphasizing growth and the like. All right, let us say that this is the pragmatic dichotomy, right? In my view, the pragmatic approach is a mix of targeted social programs and inclusive social and inclusive economic growth, right? And in this sense, I think there have been models in the past that today are still relevant. Let's not forget that the neoliberal experiments of the 1990s also had some social dimensions to them, despite the dramatic failure that they had. So today, this very dramatic push to libertarianism and the like, right, without some balance on the social side, could inevitably erode democratic stability. And so, in the sense, what I'm saying is that the realist consideration is to reduce inequality to secure social peace and democratic legitimacy. And finally, it's this question of trust and democratic pragmatism. In my view, right, the real problem right now is that we have a fundamental crisis in institutional legitimacy, right? And in this sense, as Santiago pointed out with this idea of the bad loser, right? It really is kind of this I'll call it, for lack of a better term, this Trump era pragmatism that has encouraged suspicion of traditional institutions across the region, right? We are suspect of especially electoral institutions and how electoral institutions are run. We're suspect of the judiciary. One of the key problems across the region is this enormous lack of legitimacy that judiciaries have across the region, in some countries worse than others. And so in the sense that these new leaders are going to have to deal with this issue of institutional trust by at least dealing with these three kinds of issues: the transparency of anti-corruption efforts, right? And by that I mean, let's go away from using corruption politically, right? The other thing is inclusive governance and political compromise, right? We've moved away from the idea of political compromise in the context, as again Santiago mentioned, in the context of extreme polarization, right? How are we going to be able to go back to some notion that democracy is about compromise, that democracy is about political governance between people with different visions of politics and society, right? But at the same time, leaders are going to have to deal with tangible results: security, jobs, justice, and the like. And so the real realist necessity, if you will, is that institutions will have to deliver, right, practically, to regain any sense of trust. Otherwise, I have a feeling, and I'm perhaps being too pessimistic, that democracy runs the risk of collapse. And I'm noting this sitting in the United States, where we have a president who, over the weekend, right, announced seriously that he's contemplating finding a way to run for a third term. something that we never would have anticipated, but that we often looked at Bolivia, we looked at Venezuela, and we looked at other third world countries, right? Well, this is exactly what I'm talking about now, right? That we have moments in which even advanced industrial democracies, right, are facing serious democratic erosion. And then I'll just conclude with this: that we've got this moment of geopolitical pragmatism, and so part of the problem is that these new leaders, in some measure, as Marco Rubio has told us, right, will have to make a choice, right? And the region then will have to kind of decide between the US, China, or Russia, right? And my sense, and maybe this is where I'm a little, idealistic about it, but I think that that part of the decision in the region is going to be for Latin American rulers will have to be able to balance global powers pragmatically, right? And this balancing act, I think, is going to be quite complex, especially in terms of the promises of punishment that are coming increasingly from the United States, at least. And so it seems to me, as we have even seen in the case of Milei in Argentina, right, that a realist focus, for example, on the lithium side or on other sides, that Argentina cannot even afford to simply be friends with the United States. It will have to pragmatically look at the role of other extra hemispheric powers. And so, in this sense, I'll conclude by saying, right, that we have to search for a transactional approach that looks at alliances that are based on tangible benefits for Latin America rather than ideological preferences. And so that's why, when we look at somebody like a Luisa Gonzalez winning in Ecuador, right? This kind of reflection refers to her as much as it does to somebody who might be on the right, who will have to make this transactional, this pragmatic decision at some point. Why don't I conclude there? I've already gone on for too long, and that way I can listen to our commentators.
Thank you very much, Professor Gamarra. Let's pass the word very quickly to Silvia, because we are very punctual, and she will finish this panel with her remarks, and then we close the panel and we move to the second one. Silvia, the word is yours.
Thank you very much, Lourdes. Thank you very much, FAAP, Santiago, and Eduardo for this opportunity to shed a little bit about the election trends in Latin America. I chose to talk about three elections which I consider are the most important ones that will take place in 2025. Yeah? Chile and Bolivia, that will elect new presidents, and the midterm elections in Argentina that are raising a lot of concern and a lot of expectations in Argentina and the rest of the region. Beyond the ballots themselves, these elections offers a lens into deeper political tensions and transformations playing out across the region, as Eduardo and Santiago pointed so well. So I'll start with Chile very briefly. The elections will take place in November, in 16th of November. And President Gabriel Boric came to power with the energy of the 2019 protests behind him. He was young, progressive, and a promising change in the Chilean politics. But nearly 4 years later, his popularity has dropped sharply. His reform agenda faced repeated obstacles, and his coalition has become increasingly fragmented. Still, Boric government secured a major political victory in the beginning of this year by approving a pension reform, finally replacing the private system inherited from the Pinochet era. It was a landmark, no doubt, but for many Chileans, it came too late. And now the race to succeed Boric is wide open and deeply fragmented. On the right side, we have more candidates than in the left-wing side. On the right-wing side, we have Evelyn Matei, who leads in the polls, José Antonio Cast from the far-right Republican Party, who almost won the last elections, and Johannes Kaiser, that would be the outsider, would be the Milei in the Chilean panorama, libertarian that is rising fast, tapping into social unrest. On the left, the field is totally unclear. We don't know if Gabriel Boric will manage to make a successor. Maybe Carolina Toral, which was part of his government, but not part of his party, could be the strongest candidate. And well, Bachelet was considering it, but she already said that she will not be in this dispute. So Chile's next election will test more the leadership. It will test whether the country can reconcile its progressive aspirations with rising calls for security and order, as Professor Gamarra was telling us, and whether it can contain the ascension of the far-right sentiment feeling. Talking about Bolivia, we have a power struggle between Evo Morales and Luis Arce that is shaking the country. Yeah, this conflict is not between left and right, but a deep internal fight within the ruling party, the MAS, which is not nowadays the main political force in Bolivia. Luis Arce is trying to govern and maintain distance from his predecessor. On the other side, Evo Morales, who was the president that made Luis Arce a president as well, is still popular in key regions, but now he's the main enemy of Luis Arce, and he is assuming a behavior that seems like a rebel behavior. Nowadays he's in the Chapare region, claiming political persecution while facing a lot of accusations of misconduct and misbehavior. He is being accused of sexual molesting a minor. So he became a rebel, an ex-president that's now a rebel against the regime and menacing the democracy in Bolivia. This internal war has paralyzed the party and the country, weakening the government and opening the door to a conservative opposition that is raising. And neighboring countries like Brazil are watching this very closely because Bolivia is in a strategic country for Brazilian economics. In short, Bolivia's election is not just about choosing a leader. It's about defining the legacy of Evo Morales and whether the country can move beyond personalistic politics. And finally, Argentina will define if Javier Milei will have conditions to approve more reforms within his mandate. The governability of Argentina will be defined by these midterm elections. Since taking office, President Javier Milei has ruled with a minority in the Congress, no strong party behind him, no natural allies, only fragile and tactical support, mainly from former President Macri's party, the PRO. The clearest example of his weakness was the battle over the Lei de Bases, or La Lei Omnibus, Milei flagship neoliberal reform. The original proposal was sweeping deregulations, privatizations, and expanded powers for the executive. But after intense pushback, what passed was a diluted, scaled-down version made possible only by this alliance with Macri's party. Milei also pushed through the elimination of the primary elections, officially to cut spending, but in reality it seemed as a move to tighten control over candidates and avoid dissent. It will be Milei's first major test at the polls since taking power. If he expands majority, he could push forward with more radical reforms. But if he fails, he may face deeper political isolation and manifestations that are already growing on the streets. Well, as a conclusion, and I would say that in all three countries, Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina, the stakes are high, but the paths are uncertain. In Chile, the progressive wave, the brought Boric to power, now faces fatigue and fragmentations. And we see the far right gaining ground, with multiple candidates rising in the polls. That should raise a broader regional alert. Discontent is opening doors to political projects with the authoritarian tones. In Bolivia, the left is imploding from within, but it's not just an internal crisis. Bolivia plays an strategic role for Brazil and its neighbors, especially in terms of energy, trade, and migration. Instability there may spill over borders and create regional tensions. And in Argentina, finally, Milei's chainsaw politics will be tested, not by ideology, but by the limits of democratic negotiation. So that what's at stake this year is more than who wins or loses. It's the question of whether Latin America democracies can still resist polarization, authoritarian drift, and institutional decay, while responding to the economic and social demands of their people.
Thank you very much, Silvia. Since we are going to move to the second panel, but I think we have still some time, 5 minutes, and I think Professor Martin Redal is here with us, and just to check if he's here with us. And we continue because I have some comments on YouTube. Edson de Matos, I think he's a Brazilian who lives in Peru. Edson, if I'm right, you can say yes. And he's saying, he wrote in Portuguese, hoje tanto na Bolívia, Chile, Peru e Equador estão com políticas, meu ponto de vista, muito confusas e populistas. He's saying that in Bolivia, Chile, and Peru, they are having politics very confusing and populist. No define si son marxistas, comunistas, or socialistas. They don't define themselves if they are Marxists, communists, or socialists. And I think it's just a comment. And he doesn't want to see Brazil. And my comments, and I think I have a question for any of you, is I think all of you mentioned, besides polarization and populism and these waves we are facing in the region, you mentioned the trust in institutions. I think that's a key point in the current situation we are facing in our countries. And I want to make an exception. It's my country, Silvia, Uruguay, because
Yeah.
in Europe, everything looks to function very well. We have recently a change in the government, and nothing happened. Nothing happened before when President Lacalle won, and we are changing, from Partido Blanco to Frente Amplio that Professor Santiago mentioned was founded in 1971, and nothing happened. The institutions looks to be working in my country, but unfortunately, this is an exception in the region. So how to recover trust in the institutions and in the electoral processes? Because that's the point, right? Yes, go ahead, Professor Gamarra.
En español, la elección hace la regla, ¿no? Pero, let me just make one comment about Silvia's presentation, which I think was really good in terms of the comparative frame. Okay, it's interesting. I'm a Bolivian, and so listening to you as a Brazilian analyzing the Bolivian case is really interesting because I think your notion of energy, trade, and migration as issues that outside of Bolivia, people are looking at Bolivia for, right? I don't think that fully has reached the Bolivian discussion, right? Bolivia has no more energy. It is importing all of its energy, all right? And there has been no investment in energy, so that's dead, right? Bolivians don't really see themselves as a country of immigrants, right? Even though if you're in Brazil or if you're in Argentina, where your immigrants are very big from, and then the final thing on trade, I think one of the things that's really key in looking at the role of oppositions across the hemisphere, right? I think it's really interesting. Despite the division in the MAS, the opposition is still unable to come together around a single candidate, right? Even though they're promising to have a referendum of sorts through a survey, right? But this has been a key in Latin America. We we don't study oppositions as much as we should, right? And it seems to me that largely to defeat types of governments like the MAS in Bolivia or Maduro or whomever, the opposition still hasn't found a key, right? And we always still point to the Chilean example of 19 what was it 89, right? Under the what was it the Concertación and so on. But this is, I think, a very significant moment for oppositions and to understand how oppositions can come in some sort of way to come together and present a pragmatic alternative, as I've been trying to argue. Okay.
Santiago, do you want to add something?
I want to make some comments about Javier Milei and Argentina, but in the next panel you will know all my comments.
Yes, sure.
But I like to highlight one fact is Eduardo has highlighted the role of the opposition. Well, in the next panel, I talk about the role of the opposition and the fragmentation of opposition, that there is a problem not only in Argentina, but in other countries of Latin America. The role of the opposition is a central key to understand how different governments can guarantee his reform programs. And this is the case of Javier Milei, but well, I'll talk about it in a few minutes.
Perfect. So because there's time to move to the next panel, I'm going to thank you all for this panel. It's wonderful. I think we didn't have time to go deep, but your remarks were wonderful. And I think they give a very good idea of what's going on in the region. Even for those who don't know, because we have international students online who are coming from different countries, and I think it's very important for them to understand the situation and the picture of the Latin American region in terms of politics, elections, and these issues we are facing together as a country. Professor Eduardo Gamarra, thank you very much for being here with us. It is a great, great pleasure. Bye-bye, Professor. Bye-bye. We keep with the Santiago and Silvia, and we are going to invite to join us Professor Martín Redrado, who is going to participate in the next panel. Professor, how are you doing?
Very well, it's a pleasure to join you.
Thank you very much.
Good.
Okay, so let's start the next panel. The next panel is, as Professor Santiago mentioned before, we are going to talk about Milei. The Milei era in Argentina, government analysis by specialists. And I think that's a wonderful opportunity to find out your impressions and your remarks about the presidency of Javier Milei, and who I mentioned before, he's graduated from the same university you teach for, Professor Santiago. And in this session, and I'm going to invite again Professor Martín Redrado to join us in a minute in video and audio. In this session, we have the same panelists as before. We have Professor Santiago Leiras, a political scientist. I'm not going to introduce you again, maybe, because maybe we don't have all the same people participating. Very quickly, okay? Very quickly. Santiago Leiras, as I mentioned before in the first panel, he is a political scientist, graduated at the Universidad de Belgrano, in Universidad de Buenos Aires in Argentina. He has advanced studies and a PhD in Ortega y Gasset Institute in Spain, Madrid, Spain, and he is associate professor of the Universidad de Buenos Aires and Universidad de Belgrano. He's the author of the book and also the editor of several books. One of the books is The Southern Cone and Its Leaders in Latin America, Carlos Menem and Fernando Collor de Mello in Comparative Perspective, and also compelling books like State of Exception and Democracy in Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, and Venezuela in Comparative Perspective, Democracy and State of Exception, Argentina, 1985, 2008, South America at the beginning of the new millennium, between continuity and change, and left turn of switch to the center, South America between continuity and change. And he has a lot of publications and articles. And then we are going to come with the presence of Professor Martín Redrado. He's the director of Fundación Capital, visiting professor in the Department of Economics, Florida International University, senior leadership fellow, Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom, director of the Master in Central Bank in Asian Business School, secretary for Strategic Affairs of the Government of the City of Buenos Aires until December 2023, senior economic advisor at the World Bank, Washington, D.C., 2015-2016, member of Dispute Settlement Board of the World Trade Organization, 2012-2013, president of the Central Bank of the Republic of Argentina, September 2004 to January 2010, and professor on international economics and at the Pontifical Catholic University of Argentina. There's a long presentation of Professor Martín Redrado. We start not saying that he founded Fundación Capital in 1994, an institution dedicated to economic research and public policy design, where he served as a chief economist until 2001, and he's graduated at Harvard University with a master's degree in administration. He's the author of several books, including the most recent, which is Argentina Primero, Grupo Planeta, Las Cuentas Pendientes, las cuentas pendientes sin reservas, cómo sobrevivir a la globalización, exportar para crecer. Argentina First, the pending debts, without any reservation, how to serve the globalization, how to survive to globalization, and export as for growth, right? Something like that. I translate it very quickly for you who cannot understand. So we have, it's a great pleasure to have Professor Santiago Leiras, Professor Martín Redrado, who is now, he lives in the States right now, but he is now in Buenos Aires, he told me. And let's pass very quickly, and you, Silvia, let's pass very quickly the word to Santiago. Santiago, you want to share your PPT or you want me to do it? I can try to do it. I have it open. I have it open. Let's see if we have the PPT. Yes, can you see it? Yes?
Perfect.
Let's check online if they can see the PPT. So, okay, so maybe we can start. Santiago, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lourdes. Well, again, it's a pleasure for me to be in this panel. It's a pleasure for me to share this conference with Silvia Colombo and Martin Redrado. Well, what I try to answer is precisely this question. In the case of Javier Milei, are we in presence of political leaders or are we in presence of a prophet? Next, please. Well, but before trying to answer this question, I try to wonder about this previous question. In the first place, how can we explain the emergence of the Milei phenomenon? Or how can we explain the emergence of Javier Milei? I like to highlight at least three main factors that can explain this emergence of this phenomenon. In the first place, the failure of the democracy or its political elites. Let me make a difference. It's important to make a difference between the democracy as a political regime and its political elites. But in fact, the failure is the failure of its political elites to guarantee essential public goods, maybe education, food, throughout 42 years, no? From 1983 to present. No? Another fact to highlight is the influence of the pandemic and its consequence. On one hand, on the individual freedom in terms of the individual confidence, but on the other hand, there was the pandemic provoked a gap between the people and the political class because of different manifestations of the privilege of the political class that play open episodes of violations of these restrictions. I like to say about the Olivos Gay, for example, during the Alberto Fernández rule, Alberto Fernández presidency. No? My dear Fabiola, mi querida Fabiola, and, well, all you know this episode. And in a global context, it's important to see the influence of international climate more favorable to the emergence of anti-political expressions of the radical character, with discourse of based on open rejection of the political class, la casta, such as those that took place in the United States with Donald Trump. Well, in fact, the United States take place in the second round. Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, as you know, Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, Gabriel Boric, Pedro Castillo in Peru, among others, and the list goes on. Well, next, please. Going to the Milei presidency, I try to answer this question. What was the starting point of the Milei's experience? Milei is a head of state which had and has no experience in public administration. He only has a background as a deputy. He was elected as a deputy in 2021, the same year that he created the organization called La Libertad Avanza, Freedom Advances, but he has no previous experience in public management. At least, in fact, he has no experience in private management, in fact. He was a professional economist, a counselor, but he has no experience in management, public and private. Milei as a president is a president who has won the presidential election in the second round. You remember that he defeated Sergio Massa in the second round, but he had no governors from his party. He had no mayors, and he has a very small block of 37 deputies and 7 senators. In sum, Javier Milei lacks of institutional resources. At the same time, the president lacks street supports. There is a fight regarding as who controls the street, the government and the social movements. In fact, the street is under the control of the too many different social movements, and the only one support that Javier Milei has is from the markets on one side, but on the public opinion. But we are talking about a very conditional support from the economic markets and from the public opinion, because its conditional support is subject to management results. Well, the great challenge would be how to ensure governance and at the same time support for its ambitious reform program. Next, please. Well, in spite of this context, Javier Milei at this moment has guaranteed governance. Well, it's a good opportunity to wonder which factors made it finally made it possible, in spite of this context, to guarantee governance for Javier Milei. I like to highlight at least 4 factors. The first one is a several adjustment program that nonetheless has gained the support of a significant part of the Argentinian society. Well, the second reason explains the first one, in fact. Because the adjustment program allowed a significant drop in inflation rate from 25% in December 2023, when Javier Milei took in charge, to 2.1% in January 2025. In fact, there was a slightly increase in February, and this effect another slight increase in the month of March. Well, regarding us, these economic details, Martín Delgado will talk about us. But I like to address to the political factors. And the third factor is very important because the fragmentation of the electoral coalitions existing coalitions until December 2023 is important to explain the success of or the partial success of this economic program, especially the case of the Juntos por el Cambio. Well, in fact, former Juntos por el Cambio, ex Juntos por el Cambio. Juntos por el Cambio doesn't already exist. There are a lot of islands. Another political factor is the discrediting of the more radical opposition alternative, the kirchnerismo, as the principal of the majority part of the peronism, and the radical left. Well, the radical left is, let's say, a residual political expression. He has a presence in the deputy camera, but he has no presence in the Senate. The next, please. Yes. Well, going to the principal questions, the question was, are we dealing, in the case of Javier Milei, with the prophet, or are we dealing with the pragmatic political leaders? Well, this is my answer is ambiguous answer, because Milei sees himself not as a political leadership, but he sees himself as a prophet, And in that conditions, he sees himself as coming not to fulfill a constitutional mandate, but a mission. A prophet has to fulfill a mission. Well, in this context, you can understand all his references, for instance, to the book of Maccabeos, and his expectation of leading a cultural current against progressist agenda, gender issues, and so on. But on the other hand, Javier Milei has tended, besides himself, to build bridges with different sectors of the political class that he sorely criticized using the term casta. Well, in fact, he uses another terms, rats, mandrill, and the list goes on, in order to secure its reform agenda. Well, regarding us, the fragmentation that I have highlighted, the fragmentation of the opposition, especially former Juntos por el Cambio, has enabled it to launch its reform program, even with conditions. Example, well, the omnibus law, well, in fact, the omnibus became a microbus, a taxi. It's a program, more moderate reform program. Next. Well, and this is the moment for different question. Why? Because during the last weeks, and as a consequence of a series of mistakes made by Javier Milei, the political honeymoon seems to be finished. That is that the polls at least highlight. Let me introduce a list of serious mistakes. Well, in the first place, the Javier Milei political discourse in Davos, the Cryptogate scandal, the Libra-gate, the scandalous opening of the Congress on March 1st, the episode of violence in the street during the mobilization of the retired person. Well, all these mistakes allow us to wonder how will the impact of these mistakes on the Milei supports of the public opinion and the markets. Silvia had talked about the electoral campaign in Argentina. Well, perhaps this question will be answered during the development of the political campaign. Another question is, will be there any political margin for an impeachment in terms of the episode of as Aníbal Perliñán says, new political instability? Are we in present of the end of the cycle of governance? Well, questions. Well, the next. Well, and finally, let me introduce Javier Milei. He's Javier Milei with his favorite toy, the chainsaw, the motosierra. Well, in fact, the chainsaw is the representation of the, in symbolic terms, of his program of reform. Well, from my part, it's the end of my presentation. Thanks for your hearing to me, and I will be delighted to hear the comments and the presentation of Martín Redrado and Silvia Colombo. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Santiago. Let's call to the panel, Professor Martín Redrado. Meanwhile, I look for his presentation to share with you. Professor Redrado, please say something so we can hear you and make sure your connection is okay, and that the image is perfect, by the way. Just say something that we can hear you.
Yeah, a pleasure speaking and a pleasure sharing this distinguished panel, particularly with Santiago and with you, and focusing on the economic challenges and the economic developments that are going on, particularly now in what you call the Milei era. If we can go also, if you can help me out with my presentation, if we can start putting the first slides that I prepared for this brief presentation, and then leave it open for questions. Clearly, Santiago said very in a very clear way Mr. Milei's arrival to the presidency is more a failure of the political establishment to deliver the public goods that needs to be delivered in order to have better standards of living, and as it has happened in many other countries, not only in Latin America, but around the world. The first, I would say, asset that he has got in his first year of presidency is something that is very clear for us in any of our individual handling of our economy, either in our enterprises or in our businesses or in our homes, that is particularly having fiscal equilibrium. That is to say, to have a balance between revenues and expenditures, and that is something that
Professor, the presentation is here. You let me know when you want me
yes,
to
exactly. No, I am seeing it perfectly, and I'm seeing you both. So we are in good shape. As I was saying, if you look at the last 134 years of history in Argentina, only 6 years there has been a fiscal surplus. So clearly having a fiscal equilibrium is something that is a key difference from what Argentina had before, and what you had at the end of the previous administration was a total mismanagement of public revenues, a public sector deficit that was financed by the central bank. So one of the key, and we can go to the first slide, please. One of the key assets that in my analysis has really made a change in Argentina is the concept of fiscal balance. That is not only a concept of the president himself. Of course, he is, in my opinion, the president that has had the more fiscal commitment that we know in since I would say in the last decades. I was going to say since the beginning of democracy, but I could go further down in our very difficult political history to find a president that has this commitment to fiscal equilibrium. And what you see here is the history in terms of months. You can see how from negative, if you look at the first graph on our left, you see all the negative in terms of the fiscal deficits that we had in terms of Argentina, as the arrow is pointing out very well, and the turnaround that has happened in all of the Milei period. There's only, when you have some negative month in the month of December where bonuses are paid to the public sector, but overall, the fiscal surplus that Argentina has had, was achieved of almost 1.2% of GDP, coming from a minus 5.2. So this has been unheard of in Argentinian history, and you see that it has done with some very severe cuts. One of them that you could say, I could join you in saying that was very unfair, the one that we've seen for the retired and the pension people. But what you can see is that this year, the expenditure that has come down, you see the graph on the right, which shows the expenditure done as a percentage of GDP on the retired population, has gone down from 2023 to 2024 from 6.7 to 6.2, but now it's going back to 6.7. So as very big asset, the equilibrium, but the challenges ahead are very important in order to maintain this equilibrium. But I would say that the main asset is that this has been really very much taken as a value by the majority of the population in Argentina. As we see in this dichotomy that Santiago presented, what I will add is no matter who comes after, if Milei does well, he himself, or if somebody else comes after 2027, I doubted that the majority of the population will say okay to a guy that promises to spend more, to increase salaries graciously, to use the central bank for printing money. That, in my view, is over, given the failure that the political class has had. So I would say this is an asset not only on the government, I would put as a challenging hypothesis that it has been taken by the majority of Argentinians. The second macroeconomic event, and if we can go to the next slide, please, is an independent central bank. which is basically, you mentioned my tenure as governor or president of the Central Bank of Argentina, and not everyone has the obligation to remember, but I left the central bank when the president of the republic wanted to grab by a decree and not going to Congress through a law, grab the reserves of the central bank, that's to say, grabs the dollars of the Argentinians that were backing the currency, that were backing the pesos circulating in the economy. And unfortunately, well, that led to a book, my fourth book, which is called No Reserve. It's the only one that has been translated by Amazon into English, where basically my stand was, these are the dollars of the Argentinians, not of the president of the republic, not of the president of the central bank. And that led to myself going to court, dropping, or the executive power had to drop the decree grabbing the central bank reserves. And then I decided to resign because clearly it was created a conflict between the central bank and the presidency of the republic. But after I left, unfortunately, the central bank was used as a printing mint, basically to finance all the public sector deficit. And what you have is a commitment since 2024, not that the central bank doesn't finance anymore the public sector, and you see 0 and 0, that is to say the advancements, the money that was before taken from the government to the central bank. So second asset that you have, and these two, second asset of this government, and these two issues has led to a bringing down of inflation. That is probably the main sort of political mandate and the main political asset that the government is going to show in the midterm election. Now, macroeconomic policy is done by 4 key vectors: fiscal policy, monetary policy. Let's go to the third one, which is financial policy. And last but not least, we're going to talk about the exchange rate policy. In the financing, Argentina is still very dependent on the IMF. And what you see is here the schedule, or the debt schedule of payments, which is far from being normal. So what you could say is the first two sort of vectors of macroeconomic policy, you have a change of 180 degrees and a change for really having a solid macroeconomic or solid fiscal and monetary policy. Now, in terms of financing policy, still a long way to go to becoming a normal country. What is a normal country? A country that has access to international capital markets, that has a fiscal surplus in order to pay down the interest of its debt, and renewing the maturity of its debt in the voluntary capital markets. That is not the case yet for Argentina. And as you may know, the case of the day is at this point the negotiation with the IMF for a new extended fund facility program, a program that will last for the next 10 years, and the conditions that are going to emerge in the next probably month of April. We are going to have a new program, but that is the only source of foreign financing that Argentina has, and that clearly, when you go to the IMF, is because you are, I wouldn't say in intensive care, but close to intensive care. Or we went to intensive care, and now we are in the area of special attention of the hospital, I would say, but we have not given out the way out of the hospital as a normal individual. And we will go to the last challenge that this government has in terms of macroeconomic policy. And I haven't spoken about micro. I will put a few slides about how the people are feeling, because we can speak about all this macroeconomic equilibrium, but the key for an economic policy is to give more employment and better purchasing power to the people of the country where you're doing any public policy or economic policy, and we are still far from that. But the case for, which is now, if you see the headlines in Argentina, the key discussion that we have at this point, because it is a main discussion with the IMF, it is, what kind of exchange rate policy Argentina will have in the long run. As you may know, we now have what is called technically a crawling peg, which is basically that the government has a controlled exchange rate where you have exports and imports that are liquidated, and this official exchange rate is devalued every month on a pre-announced basis by 1% per month. If you look at, I asked my team, and as you are aware, this year I am a visiting professor at FIU, but with my team in Fundación Capital in Argentina, I've asked my team because I said there's probably very few countries, and this is all in a sort of in a light brown, but you see there are 3 countries that have the same color that Argentina has, which is Nicaragua, Botswana in Africa, and Argentina. Okay, so you say, well, look, when you look at the majority of countries, they have clearly a floating exchange rate. You look there at almost 61 percent, 61 countries, I'm sorry, have, and then there are some other forms of floating with any sort of intervention, but that is, the majority of the country. What is normal? Normal is a central bank that leaves the currency float and has, particularly, I would say, in emerging markets, some degree of discretion in terms of intervention in the forex market. My view and my recommendation as a policymaker is that a central bank should have a floating exchange rate with an anti-cyclical policy. And what I mean by anti-cyclical policy is that either the central bank or the treasury, when you have inflow of capital via financial flows or via better off exports that are growing or foreign direct investment, the two of the latter are clearly the ones that the government should put incentives on getting them. Well, clearly the issue there is when you have an inflow of capital, then you will have a central bank or the treasury buying dollars, and when you have a moment of volatility, as we may say, what you have, or uncertainty in the world economy and in the world financial markets, you have a central bank that has the capacity to sell those dollars in order to bring tranquility and predictability to the people in our country. So this is a main issue that needs to be settled. Argentina needs to move from a crawling peg into a floating rate, and that is the big challenge that, in my view, macroeconomic policy has. Now, let's go to my last 2 slides and show that still when you look at wages, for example, in the last in the graph on the left, I show that in the last month there's been inflation has been running over the salaries, and I have done in the other one, and I'm going to pass very quickly, union by unions. As you know, in Argentina, what we have is a negotiation by sectors of the economy, unions and different sectors. So there I put the different sectors of the economy, and what is marked in red is the month that the inflation has been higher than the salary, and in green is when the salary has been higher than inflation. In a nutshell, when you look without looking specifically at the number, you see more red than green, and then yellow when there is almost equal. When you see the average in the last 2 lines, what you see is that salaries are running behind inflation, and that is clearly a big challenge, because what you need to create, and what I will say is that Argentina has a new base, which is a more solid fiscal policy, a more solid macroeconomic policy, the challenges in financial and in exchange rate policy, but we lack a development strategy. What we call here, what I will say is that these are necessary but not sufficient conditions to have a development strategy for the next 10 years that will be federal and that will integrate all of the Argentinians. My last slide will show you what are the prospects for Argentina moving forward, which is basically there are some external factors that need to be taken into consideration. The elections this year, which so far look favorable for the official party, the party of Mr. Milei, mainly because of what Santiago has said very well, the fragmentation. What the clear advantage that the Milei administration has is that nobody in the opposition has one single smart idea, one single idea or I would say or strategy, or they are proposing to go back to the past. And what we see in the population, probably Santiago can extend more, but when you look at different polls, what you see is maybe people are not doing very well, or they say, I'm not doing very well, I'm worse off than before, but I don't want to go back. So they are able to give a new sort of, I wouldn't say a blank check, but at least a concessional check, at least for this year. The international context, we don't have time for that, but I think that in particular, what is going on with the United States gives not only a challenge, but also an opportunity to the rest of Latin America to become inserted in the supply chains that the United States is developing within the context and the continent, and not only in the US. And also, when you say, well, Argentina, may it derail again as it did in the past? Well, you will have the IMF for the next 10 years. So every 3 months, you will have an external auditor that will come to Argentina and say, yes, you are achieving the goals or the targets that we have agreed in the program. And so that is also a factor to take into consideration. What you have is local factors, as I mentioned before, fiscal balance, the regulatory measures, unilateral reduction. This could be sort of debatable, of trade barriers and non-trade barriers in a world that is looking more protectionist and looking more inside each of our countries. And also, you have to consider that out of the 32 unicorns in Latin America, 11 come from Argentina. So there's a human factor there that shows, particularly in the areas of IT, of AI, some competitive advantage that the country has vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Last but not least, no matter what happens in Argentina, no matter who becomes president in the next year, if you're looking from outside, I will tell you, the sectors that are going to do well, no matter what happens with politics, is energy. In particular, Argentina is having a major turnaround with what is going on in the second largest reservoir of shale gas and the fourth largest reservoir of shale oil in the world, which is called Vaca Muerta. It's not a good name in English, dead cow, but really the cow is very much alive because it's producing a lot of revenues for Argentina. This year, we will have a trade surplus in energy of about $9 billion, which has been unheard of. Argentina has been a net importer of energy. Biotech, IT and software development, agribusiness, logistics, and mining are the sectors that, in my view, when you look at Argentina, are the ones where you could have a competitive advantage and that could insert in the new value chain, in the new productive chains that are moving around the world with the new geopolitics within the competition of the United States and China. With that, I'd like to put a pause to my presentation and looking forward to the conclusions and any questions that may come from the audience. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Medrado. It's very, very, I think it's very important what he has shared with us. And I will pass the word to you, Silvia, so we can finish with our presentation for today with your final thoughts and summing up. Okay, let's go ahead.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief because maybe I'll repeat some remarks of Professor Santiago and Professor Martin, as this subject of the Milei phenomena is being pretty much debated in Latin America. Yeah. First of all, I agree with the main points that Professor Santiago pointed as the reasons why Milei was elected in 2023 with no traditional party and no governors behind him and no congressional majority. Milei won by channeling public fury against Kirchnerism. His slogan was clear: I came to destroy the system. For many Argentines, that felt less like a threat and more like hope. And with over 50% of the population in poverty and mainstream parties discredited, he cast himself as the only one brave enough to do what was necessary. Even as he launched the harsh austerity, slashing subsidized, deregulation the economy, and devaluing the currency, he retained support, at least at the beginning. Why? Because he built a powerful narrative. Sacrifice is noble, and Milei alone has the guts to deliver it. He framed enemies, unions, journalists, artists, and what he called La Casta, the caste, and spoke directly to the public through social media, bypassing traditional institutions. But Milei doesn't just govern through policy, he governs also through spectacle. He thrives on conflict with Congress governors, even with foreign leaders, by Twitter, not by the traditional means of traditional diplomacy or institutions. He doesn't negotiate, he provokes, he sets fire, then he stalls proudly in the flames. On the economic front, his plan was clear: chainsaw the state. His lei omnibus aimed to radically deregulate Argentina, but was ultimately gutted in Congress. He only managed partial approval and only with support from Mauricio Macri's party. The social cost of his agenda was not immediate, but we're witnessing now the growing of widespread discontents with protests on the streets. And now that they erupted, we're seeing a policy of mano dura of Patricia Bullrich, his security minister, a former leftist turned into a right-wing politician with presidential ambitions as well. She introduced a repressive anti-protest or anti-piquete protocol. During the first major march, one photojournalist was badly hurt, and now we are seeing more protests being taking the streets. So the Milei's confrontational strategy is now backfiring. Congress resists him. Governors are pushing back, and the CGT is calling strikes. His government faces new scandals from this controversial new IMF negotiations to a crypto-linked corruption case, and the streets are once again full. So what now? After everything is cut down, what's left? Because Milei, while brands himself as something radically new, we've seen the script before. In the 19th, Carlos Menem also promised market salvation and delivered inequality and finally collapsed. More recently, Mauricio Macri took the same path, including a new IMF loan, which ended in failure. Now Milei is repeating the same move. He may be louder and more theatrical, but the structural fragility is unchanged, and the risks are mounting. Javier Milei is not just an Argentine story. He's a regional warning, a symptom of political despair, and on the fall of the false promise that destruction is itself a solution. But no country can be governed by rage alone. It takes responsibility, stability, and empathy. And we didn't see it till now. And perhaps what we are witnessing now is the dawn of something new, but the loud return of something dangerous, familiar to Argentines and Latin Americans.
Thank you very much, Silvia. I think we have still some time for questions or comments coming from those who are watching us on YouTube. So Lucas is going to compile the questions, and I can open you for final remarks, if you will. First, I would like to say that in Brazil, Santiago, Silvia, and Martin, I call you by your first name. In Brazil, there are people observing what's happening there. Observing because it's like an example of what it should be a neoliberal policy in the region. And there's a growing movement in the country of anarcho-capitalist movement. And all of them remind the idea of President Milei of, dismantling the central bank. So maybe my first question goes to Professor Redrado, because you have been president of the central bank. So what are your thoughts? Is he going to manage to do that? Of course, we don't believe that. I don't believe that. But it was one of his promises during the campaign, dismantling the central bank, not having the central bank, having the economy free, blaming the central bank of the inflation processes in Argentina for a long time. And the second one also for you, Professor, is I found out, I don't know if you knew this, because I wanted to researching about Javier Milei's government. I found a university in Guatemala, Universidad Francisco Marroquín. They have an observatory. This is a reform watch on Milei. And you were talking about the reforms. Is Milei going to be able to set up all the reforms he promised before arriving to the presidency or not? So the second question goes to all of you, and the first question to Professor Martin Redrado, because you have been the president of the central bank. Please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. One thing is what you say in the campaign, and another thing is what you do when you govern. No? So you said very well that the president has been calling for not only dismantling the central bank, but dollarizing the economy. And really what has happened is, if you look at the facts, the peso has strengthened in the last 14 months. And what people will say if you come here as a tourist is that now Buenos Aires and Argentina is expensive. So what you see in reality is that you have strengthened the central bank. As I said in my second slide, what you have is a central bank that, because he shrunk the capacity of printing pesos, there are less pesos in the economy because it is not financing the government. So what you have is an appreciation of the peso. And also you could again talk about the exchange rate policy, as I said before, which is a transitional, or if you are more critical, an abnormal exchange rate policy, you will see basically the real truth when you go into a floating exchange rate. But the path that he has given in office has been to strengthen the central bank and not to close the central bank. And I haven't heard in the last month him coming back to the idea in the many press reviews or conferences or speeches that he has given, that he's coming back with that idea. So it seems that we're going to have a good, I divide the world between good central banks and bad central banks. Okay, good central banks are the ones that have in emerging markets, because it's different being a banker in the Federal Reserve or in the European Central Bank or in the Bank of Japan or even in the People Bank of China, than being a central banker in Brazil, in Colombia, in Mexico, in Argentina, or in Chile even, no? Where we are more tied to the price of commodities, we are more tied to international events, and that's why I claim that anti-cyclical policies should be the norm, or should be sort of the driving force in emerging markets. Will he be able to deliver? Your second question, that's a very interesting one. Let me give you some personal experience. The other day, I was called to give my opinion to one of the key ministers in the government, and I was telling, your reform agenda has stopped. And his response was very frank. He said, look, as Santiago said very well, we have a minority in Congress, so they will wait to, in their view, have a good result in the election and then push forward the reform agenda in the second half. But it's clear that in order basically for people not to have the idea that you're going back to the past, you need laws in Argentina. You cannot have just decrees, presidential decrees or executive orders, because an executive order is also replaced by another executive order. And Argentina is going back and forth with no policy consistency for many decades. So clearly, what you could say is, fortunately or unfortunately, we have entered into an electoral mode where you are speaking about the candidates right now. All the talk is the candidates for the election in the city of Buenos Aires. So we are entering into an electoral year. So I would say that the key challenge on the economic front will be the exchange rate. And then after the election, we will see if the government has a sufficient majority to push forward a reform agenda that will not only be of this period, but will be a long-lasting one.
Thank you very much, Santiago or Silvia. We want to comment on that?
As a journalist and as someone from abroad living in Argentina, that this moment seems very critical. I've seen a lot of discontent. I've been covering these recent marches and protests, and today the INDEC announced that poverty has fallen in Argentina, but this is not what we see, and the numbers are being contested inclusive, because we see a lot of people looking for food in the garbage in rich neighborhoods. We see people repeating that they cannot reach the end of the month, if with the numbers showing inflation going down. So it's very strange of the situation, and this feeling of something that seems to be repeating what happened in the Menem era and in the Macri era. And so what I see is different, what I feel is different from what the numbers are showing. And I'm listening a lot of people with discontent. So let's see what happens. I am pessimistic, but I don't know about you both.
Santiago?
No, I have only one short comment. In fact, more than a comment, it's a question. Another question. Are we in presence of a new area? Well, perhaps the electoral scale will confirm or not this question. Maybe answer this question. Regarding this electoral scale, I've gotten information Martin has highlighted. On May, there will be the legislative election in the Buenos Aires Federal District. This is a particular election because it is a nationalized election. So the consequence and the influence of these outcomes will be at the national dimension, or will have a national impact. Well, this is the first stage of the confirming or not that we are in presence of a new area, or it is another transition in Argentina to an Argentine new order.
Thank you. Professor Redrado, anything else you would like to add?
No, I put in mute when somebody else is speaking, so not to have a background noise. I think we have covered all. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I hope that all the people in the audience have given a fair view of what's going on and what are the challenges of Argentina ahead. And I think it's been a pleasure to share with you, particularly with Santiago, and this good combination of the politics and economics. Obviously, economics take a second role. Politics is clearly the leading indicator of how Argentina will move forward, particularly in strengthening institutions. If I can make a final comment, is that the country has still weak institutions, and that's why the questions moving forward is, will Argentina continue to improve in terms of not only setting an economic strategy, but also maintaining it in the future? Because as we see, our history will look more like an electrocardiogram. No, it's up and down, up and down, up and down. And as a result of that, if you look at, fortunately, at our GDP per capita, that is to say, the per capita income, we are at the same level at the end of this year that we were in 2006. So there is a problem of stagflation, of stagnation with high inflation that Argentina has, that hopefully will start to resolve by having a fiscal equilibrium, by having monetary discipline. But as I said before, those are necessary but not sufficient conditions for eliminating poverty, for having better prospects for our youngsters, for having better employment. The opportunities are there. Still, the country is blessed with natural resources and a great capacity of human capital. But we need to implement and solidify institutions so we could have a long and credible strategy.
Fantastic. If we can finish this panel for today, maybe it's adding what we also have discussed during the first panel, which is restoring trust in the institutions, in democratic institutions and electoral processes in the region. And at the same time, I'd like to maybe to come back to the concept of the realism, political realism, and the new approach that the region is going to face, which is the transactional approach with the Trump government. We didn't talk about that. We just talked about Argentina, and we didn't relate Argentina with the other, it's like the United States, like China, and the rest of the region. Maybe this is a topic for another conversation, but I'm practically sure that our audience have now a very nice idea of what's going on in Argentina, what's going on also in the electoral agenda in the region, and maybe to finish with maybe more policies of states instead of policies of governments, right? Maybe this is something that we need to work on, because the Plan Real in Brazil is a good example, some of the few examples of policy of state in Brazil that is working. that is working. Thank you very much, all of you. It has been a great, great pleasure to have you here with us today. And we keep in touch, and we would like to have another session like this in the future. Bye-bye, and thank you very much. Take care. Take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all
Thank you.
who are online as well on YouTube. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Chao, muchas gracias.
Pleasure.